Hello, everyone. Welcome to Life Boost here. I would like to thank you guys all for coming onto my podcast channel. I'm available to listen to on over 35 different podcasting channels and 10 social media platforms. Today, I'm speaking with one of my good friends, Dr. Mitchell Yass, that is an expert within chronic pain, and he is from Jacksonville, Florida. I'm really excited to have the privilege to speak with him and hear about his methods in regards to changing people's perspective on dealing with chronic pain. There's over 130 million different Americans that are being affected with this, and roughly 1 billion people worldwide. And this primary cause of chronic pain is misdiagnosed. And he is the type of guy that is going to be able to help you and guide you to a better success. It's really a great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Mitchell Yass. How are you doing?
I am very, very happy to be here. I think people are desperate for this information. I think we're going to really get into the weeds of it and help people understand on their own what the proper process is to identify the cause of their pain and how to resolve it. And the exciting news is that in more than 98% of cases, the cause is actually something that they can control. So that's the excitement. That's the teaser.
No, and I'm very pleased to even have you on my podcast to gain some insight and some knowledge about this. So we're going to dig deep right into it. So we'll start off with your lifestyle. Like, what got you into dealing with chronic pain?
So to understand who I am now, you kind of have to understand who I was growing up and going forward. So first of all, I was the 99-pound weakling who had sand kicked in his face. I was the guy who was nervous about walking to school, high school every day because I was afraid I was going to be beaten up. So I had a lot of self-esteem issues, and as a result of that, I knew that I had to change something within myself to make myself feel better about myself and to gain confidence. So I decided that I was going to strengthen myself, use weightlifting. And from 19 to 26, I tried to lift weights, but I had this fast metabolism. And at one point, at 26, instead of using the classic mechanisms of getting books from Joe Weider or reading Muscle Training Illustrated or information from Arnold Schwarzenegger or bodybuilders, I was fortunate enough to be able to take a high school physics course and start applying the laws of physics to weightlifting, understanding force vectors, understanding where the fulcrum point is that the force is created, understanding lever arms, understanding potential energy, kinetic energy. And shockingly, this understanding gave a guy who just could not put weight on and allowed him to put 40 pounds of muscle on in 4 years. I went from 160 pounds to 200 pounds in 4 years. Now, at that period of time, I was in my first career. I was a project manager in construction. And over 5 years, it just felt like it wasn't right for me. I ended up being that kind of guy who was just going to work to get the paycheck. And at some point, you realize you can't survive very long like that. So I quit that, and I found out about this thing called physical therapy. And the thing with physical therapy was going to be, well, it's in the medical field. I can help people, but I don't have to go through the full the curriculum to reach the level of a physician. So it seemed like a good fit for me. And for these last few years, I had been doing weightlifting and really got into understanding the body. So I entered the school, and I'm recognizing that a lot of what's being said doesn't really make sense. It's not logical in terms of how to identify the cause of pain. And one of the other things that I took from a child was my father taught me how to be analytical, how to use logical analysis when I was about 8 years old. And I took that forward. So basically the way my brain works, which I think is somewhat unique, is that every bit of information that comes into my brain goes through a logical lens. It's analyzed. Every bit of information. And it's either logical and factual or not logical and not fact. So I'm in these classes, and just a lot of different things are seeming to me to not be true. So finally, at the end of your educational component, you do your affiliations where you're now in front of somebody and you're treating them. And so what happened was you're taught that at the knee, well, someone's diagnosed with a meniscal tear, which is the cartilage that sits between the thigh bone and lower leg bone. Okay, that's the cause, you're going to treat that. Or, oh, they have back pain. Oh, a herniated disc or stenosis is found. That's what you're going to treat because that's what's found on the MRI. And the referring physician has said that's the cause of their pain. Well, for some reason, I just seemed to be this guy who was so inquisitive about what was going on. I would ask the person, so could you just point to where your pain is? It seemed like the most obvious first question. Could you just point to where your pain is so I know what we're talking about? It seems logical, but nobody else was doing it. And here was the shocker. The shocker was that when they pointed to where their pain was, it was not the place it should be based on the referring diagnosis and where that would create pain. It was literally in two different places. So if we go to this knee issue, if we talk about the meniscus being the cause of pain, that should cause pain between the thigh bone and lower leg bone at a place called the joint line. It's the line between the thigh bone and lower leg bone. But their pain was around their kneecap. And that joint between the kneecap and the thigh bone is a completely separate joint. So you can't have a structure of one joint create pain at another joint. If you are willing to accept that, then I can say, well, arthritis at your elbow causes pain at your ankle. And you would say, well, clearly that's insane. Well, this is insane. It's lunacy. And so literally almost every single patient, and you have to understand, I'm just a student and subsequently just graduating and treating people. And I'm finding that almost every person I'm treating has pain in a place where it shouldn't be based on a diagnosis that was given.
Very true.
And so you start to run into this very serious emotional and mental quandary. You've just been educated to follow a course of action, and yet you know for sure that course of action isn't matching what this individual who's standing in front of you is presenting. So what do? And you just graduated. You just started doing what you're doing for a living. So it's very tough. And I have to tell you, for several months, I was really distraught because when I did evaluate the symptoms that the person was presenting with, it showed that the tissue in distress that they were presenting was actually muscle. It was muscles creating their symptoms. Either it was the muscle, if I pressed on the tissue that they were talking or they were pointing to, that was a muscle. If it came down to the pain around the kneecap, well, that was because the muscle was tight or overstrengthened to the point where it's putting excessive force on the kneecap, which altered how the kneecap moved, and that's why they had the pain. It was all this type of stuff happening. And so being the person I was, I said, as much as I'm nervous and concerned, I'm going to follow the path of trying to understand what the person was presenting, because that seemed more real. That was real. That's what the person was feeling. And so I just was recognizing that these were muscular deficits. I would do some massage, some stretching. I would do some strengthening. And in treatment, 2 treatments and 3 treatments, the person was pain-free and fully functional.
Wow.
Done. Amazed. Shocked. And you must understand, I was amazed and shocked. I was like, I don't know what the hell is going on. How could this possibly? I just spent all this time in my training and education, and here I'm doing this, and this is working like fast. And so I just continued to follow the process and then began trying to create theory. I started saying, well, if I press on a knot and they have massive levels of pain and I checked the flexibility of that muscle and it was shortened and tightened and it was incredibly weak, and then I massaged the knot and suddenly their pain was gone, they had greater flexibility and greater strength. What the hell did I just do to that muscle? And I created theory. And this has gone on and on and on for 28 years. Basically, the Yass Method is based on an experimental model, if you will, of treating people almost instinctively, and then when things worked, creating theory to justify what was happening. So going forward, I would be confident that what I was doing was going to work. And that's the process that this has unfolded over 28 years now.
That's incredible to see the development from when you first started, and you're just like, wow, I was trained to do something in this way, but it's doing the complete opposite and it's not actually working. But when I applied this theory and I created my own method and made it happen, it turned into kind of like an evolution for yourself to say, hey, I'm actually now helping people. I'm now saving people from chronic pain and helping people by applying the Yass Method and by applying your theory and your principles. Why does your principles work in particular?
So let's look at the concept of what are the background elements. So again, it wasn't just, I didn't just analyze what was happening in the individual. I was saying to myself, let's look at the bigger picture and see what's happening. So I'm going to give you some shocking concepts that nobody's ever thought of. So number one, has chronic pain ever existed in the history of mankind?
Yes.
The answer is no, it never has. You can go back to Hippocrates' time.
Really?
You can go through the Roman period. Chronic pain has never existed until the late 1980s, 1990s, which is when this thing exploded. In 2008, when I wrote my first book, 75 million people suffering from chronic pain. By 2013, 5 years later, 130 million Americans suffering, roughly 1 billion people worldwide. Okay? So you have to say to yourself, what's different? Why? And there's, I don't think anyone disagrees that pain is the number one health-related issue in the world. It's not cancer. It's not cardiovascular disease. It's pain. 1 billion people, 1 out of every 7 in the world suffering. So you have to say, well, what happened? And the answer is technology, automation, advancements in cell phones and all this other stuff. And basically, what you see is that people are doing jobs that require minimal amounts of strength. So where can you see things like that? Well, when I was a kid, if I had to make a deposit at a bank, I would go to the teller and the teller would take my money and count the money, and they would put it in somewhere, and then they'd give me a receipt. And so they sat there and they physically do stuff. Well, now there's an ATM. It's not a human, it's a robot, right? When I was a teenager, I worked in a stock room that stocked electrical supplies. I literally had to walk up and down ladders and pull the stuff that they wanted me to pull and box stuff, and it was very physically demanding. Everybody knows, if you've ever seen what happens at an Amazon plant, it's all robots. So there's a guy sitting and watching robots, right? What's the number one job area in the world today? No questions asked. IT. Everybody's sitting at a computer, right? When kids go to school now in college, I had that backpack and I had to carry all my books. Most of the courses are online now. So you're carrying your little laptop and you're just sitting there, right? It is so bad that if I want to change the channel on my television, I pick up my remote control and I talk into it and I say, change the channel. You don't even have to use your freaking thumb anymore.
But you're so right, though. Technology is like going quicker and quicker and quicker to the point where now we are depending on technology so much to do physical things and to actually do things, right?
And so that's the reason. And by the way, there is a scientific recognition so that people understand that what I'm saying is embraced fully by the medical and scientific establishment. It is established that type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity are the direct result of these advancements, that these are not evolutionary diseases. These are diseases of sedentary, and they've actually said that the concept of survival of the fittest has now stopped. There is no longer a survival of the fittest because technology has taken over for man. You don't have to be fit to be successful. And so this is true. So they've accepted this idea for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. Nobody's picked it up relating to pain except for me. Now, another way you could look at this is in 1970-something, what was the average age of the person suffering from chronic pain? What was the primary group that suffered from pain? It was the elderly, seniors. They did. They used to call it rheumatism. My rheumatism's acting up, right? And it was all this type of stuff. This is what people said.
It's awesome. It's awesome. Yeah.
It's true. And so what do you notice now? So the age of the population from suffering from chronic pain has plummeted all the way down to the teens. It's now down to the teens. I treat college kids. I had a 21-year-old girl who said she felt like her head was a bobblehead. She can't support the weight of her head. That's how weak her neck muscles have become, because in college she sits and looks at a laptop for 8 to 10 hours a day, her head's forward. It's creating a load that shouldn't have been there, that your muscles weren't designed to do. She never strengthened the muscles or her shoulders, which is the muscles that support the head. So as a result, she can't even support the weight of her head. I've got 19 and 20-year-olds who can't sit in a college course for 2 to 3 hours to take the lecture because they're having such levels of sciatica. Not because sciatica comes from the lumbar spine. It's actually associated with strained muscles associated with the hip region. So their muscles have weakened to the point where they're straining and impinging on the sciatic nerve, and they can't sit in their classes. Think about, if this is real, which makes it empirical, it is what is, you have to be able to explain that into your theory as to what you're trying to treat. So ultimately, what is this telling you about what is the core reason that chronic pain exists? Number one, we live in a gravitational environment, therefore force is being pushed down on us. And for us to perform any activity, we have to push up against it. Therefore, our muscles have to create a certain amount of force to match the force of gravity to allow us to do any activity, right? So we need a certain level of strength. Well, if we're not using our muscles, what happened to our strength? We lost it. And so when we go to try to do activity, the muscle strength isn't available, so the muscles strain and elicit pain. So that's the reason for the high level of acute pain that has occurred. The amount of people seeking care has gone up geometrically, exponentially. For that reason, the reason for chronic pain is that along with this lovely technology came the MRI. And the MRI identifies structural abnormalities, herniated disc, stenosis, arthritis, meniscal tears, compression fractures. My question to everybody to understand is, do they find muscular causes? A muscle strain, a weakness, or an imbalance, any of that nature? No, they don't show up. So if you have a back muscle that's in spasm and you want to shoot yourself because you can't take that pain anymore, you can get an MRI. It's never showing up. So as a result of that, you're treating the structural variations that are showing up. Since you're treating that tissue and it is not the tissue in distress, the muscle continues to be in distress because it doesn't have enough force. So it continues to strain and emit the emergency signal, distress signal of pain, trying to make you aware that it's not functioning, trying to make you aware it's muscle, which will then give you the ability to create the intervention of strengthening the muscle to where its force output is greater than the force requirement, and then you could live pain-free and fully functional. So that's a synopsis as to what's real, what you can really see, and why chronic pain today exists.
Very interesting to kind of see that perspective that, you don't even realize that, when you sit down all day and you're doing the same thing repetitively over and over again, people think like, oh, okay, nothing's going to happen to me because I'm on a comfy couch. I'm in a safe environment. Everything's okay, right? But your body needs to move. It needs to be constantly moving, right? And if you stay in these positions for way too long, like you said, it can cause serious amounts of strain. And even like you said, if you live an obesity lifestyle where, you're eating unhealthy, you're sleeping bad, you're not following a regimen, that's something that's going to benefit your overall lifestyle, you're going to be strongly affected. And it's just very interesting to see that you're relating technology and you're relating to basic things that humans use every day to depend on to be successful, right? So it is super interesting. What would be some techniques or some ways that people could manage their pain in these environments? Like if someone is working IT or if somebody is working in a stationary environment?
That's such a great question. That's what I wanted to get to. And I did a different podcast, and I pointed this out, and the guy's like, oh, my God, I never, ever perceived this way. This is shocking. This is really good stuff. So let's say you're that person that sits all day, 8 to 10 hours, right? And I first want you to understand why you're getting your lower back pain. So I don't know if anyone can see this, but I'll try to just bring this a little bit closer. Hopefully it'll be a little helpful. So if we're looking here, this is your lumbar spine, this is your pelvis. This is a muscle called the psoas muscle. It attaches from all 5 lumbar spine all the way down to the hip. It runs from your back, actually through your abdominal cavity forward to the hip. Okay? Now, that muscle is at its optimal length when you are standing. So if we look at the angle between your torso and your leg, your thigh, it's 180 degrees. When you go to sit, you've now cut that distance in half to 90 degrees. So that muscle is going to shorten for the very reason you've cut the length of range that it has to sustain in half, okay? So for every muscle, there's an equal and opposing muscle. So for the psoas muscle, there's your butt muscle, the gluteus maximus muscle. So the psoas muscle bends you forward. It's called hip flexion. The butt muscle brings you back. It's called hip extension. They're the two opposite motions. So if that person has to sit for a sustained period of time, they have to recognize the psoas muscle is going to shorten. Well, if it shortens for a long enough period of time, it could actually almost want to sustain that position and strain. It's going to strain. The fibers are going to draw, like kind of get drawn together and almost stick in that position. Now, that could lead to spasm, or it could lead to where you don't have pain now, but God forbid you go to stand up, you're going to get this shot of pain in your lower back. So that's what's happening. So the question, and this is my position, we talk about first responders, firemen, policemen, EMT. Nobody has a problem with saying, oh, my God, if I was to be a fireman, yeah, I think I got to condition myself. If I'm a policeman, I got to condition myself because these are strenuous activities. If I'm an athlete, certainly conditioning is a part of it. But what I want people to understand is that if you're sitting for 10 hours in a very specific activity, which is sitting, you got to condition yourself. You've got to make it so that that psoas or hip flexor doesn't have such an intense desire to want to shorten, leading to pain and your ability to sit, which is what you need to do to make a living. So if you were to strengthen your butt muscle, your gluteus maximus, and your hamstrings, which are the two hip extensors, the muscles that oppose the hip flexor from shortening, you'll create such an excessive tone that's going to want to pull you back that feeling, that sensation will stop the psoas muscle from shortening when you're sitting, preventing you from straining and creating your back pain. So what's my message? That's my message for every place. People always hear about tennis elbow or typing. These are overuse syndromes, the word overuse. Think about what that means. The implication is that you're doing it too much, and therefore you're having a problem. The answer is there's no such thing. Activities require a certain force load. It's simply, to do it, you need this much effort. Yeah. Now, if you're doing it a lot, you just need a lot of effort often. So requiring a lot of effort often doesn't mean there's a too much or too little. It's a question of, do I have the strength, the force output to create that force load often? That's the answer. So there really isn't an overuse situation. It's an underconditioned situation. That's your problem. That's your problem. You ain't strong enough to sit there for 8 to 10 hours a day. That's why you're getting back pain. So the answer isn't stop your job, spend $10,000 on a new chair, buy a standing desk, get the special lumbar pillow, take drugs to try to numb your brain. The answer is condition yourself. You're having pain because you are not conditioned to do that activity. Like you said, people will say, well, it's sitting. Sitting's an activity. Sitting's an activity. If you're not laying flat on the floor, completely flat on the floor, you're doing an activity. Because something you're doing is making you have to work against gravity. End of story. Therefore, you better be conditioning your muscles to allow you to do that activity. I don't care if it's a very subdued type of activity like sitting or being a fireman or a policeman or an athlete. It's all the same. And once people, this is a pure realization. This is a mindset issue. You take on that mindset, you'll never have pain. because you'll recognize that every time you have pain, it's associated, and you're associating with doing an activity. You know your only issue is you're just not strong enough. Figure out what muscles are required to do the activity, strengthen them appropriately. You do the activity as much and as intensely as you want.
Very interesting. Holy crap. That was a lot of good information, right? Very interesting to actually take like a good perspective and just say, hey, condition yourself, focus on yourself. Even sitting is an activity for yourself. And people just don't even realize that, yes, you're sitting, but you're still fighting against gravity, which is still a primary issue. And if you're doing that continuously as a lifestyle, it's going to really drive you down. And it's super interesting to hear that concept about what you just said. Can stress relate to your muscles being hurt or not having good mental health? Does having poor mental health relate to poor muscle pain or poor pain in general?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the things most people think about when they're talking about general health, not just muscular health, but general physical health, people always talk, this is where, the biggest place everyone talks about is diet. That's because it's a gazillion-dollar business, right? And the answer is, if you stop thinking about foods in a emotional way or characterizing your foods, you'll realize that they're just macronutrients. You have carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. If you just stop thinking about your foods as, oh, it's a good food or a bad food, just think about them as carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Those are the macronutrients we need. Carbohydrates we need for anaerobic activity, where we're huffing and puffing, so running, jumping, twisting, bending, any of that stuff, right? Proteins we need because certain hormones are protein-based. We need it for muscle. We need it for other reasons, right? And then fats, this is the part nobody understands. Right now you're sitting there, and you have to be kept alive. So your cardiovascular system's pumping blood, your gastrointestinal system's making glucose, your pulmonary system's making oxygen, your immune system is protecting you, and there's an energy source for that. That's called metabolism. The energy source, the primary energy source for that is fat. So for anyone who say they don't need fat, that's just dumb. There are fat-soluble vitamins that you can only get in fat. It's just foolishness. So just think carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. Just think that. And say to yourself, I probably don't want the primary thing that I take in to be fat. So I want to take in a good amount of carbohydrates, a good amount of proteins, and some fat. And that's the nutrient thing, right? Stop the diet, stop all the different programs and everything else that's out there. It's making money for people. But if you really just want to understand what to eat, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And you'll be good to go. And then follow up if you need with your vitamins and minerals and stuff. But basically, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Now, a place that nobody talks about because there's really no money in it is the exercise part. And that's quite simply, you need to sustain enough strength to be able to perform your function without symptom. And that's just a general program, and it's falsely presented. You need to do all these things 7 days a week and 10 hours a day, 3 days a week, maybe an hour of time, hour and a half time each day, and primarily using progressive resistance because that's the only exercise basis that allows your resting metabolic rate to be maintained. Cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular exercise, or any of these other types of things do not sustain your This is from Tufts University. That's the university. Tufts University is where all understanding about physiology, strength, and effect on the body comes from. That's where all the studies are done. And they did a study, and they have acknowledged straight out. There's something called the Recommendations for Exercise, the American College of Exercise, I think it is. Something like that on a yearly basis makes recommendations. And they recommend that strength training be an integral part of a person's exercise routine, and it was because they finally recognized that it is the only form of exercise that allows to sustain the resting metabolic rate because it's the only one that's challenging your muscle to increase its ability to push against resistance, which is what sustains muscle. Okay, so, if you want to do some of these other things, that's great, but just try to keep at the core of your exercise routine progressive resistance, strength training, in whatever form you want to do that, right? But let's talk about the thing that really kills people. Stress. Straight out, man. I don't really care what you eat. I don't care how strong you are. If you're stressed out, you're going to die. And the reason, quite simply, is what is life? What is life? Life consists of the fact that you're making new cells, and cells are dying. When you make more cells than cells are dying, you're doing good. When you're having more cells dying than being produced, you're dying. So what is the thing that allows disease to enter, antigens to enter and not be addressed properly? What allows that to happen? Stress. Stress weakens the immune system. And so you're basically making I'm glad that you're eating right and you're exercising, but you're basically inciting an environment where disease can fester. So
very true.
I think the answer, the primary first thing anyone can do for themselves to have any sense of health is figure out how to reduce stress. That is by far the most important thing. Now, it does in having stress, I think that it can increase what's known as the resting tone of your muscle. You're tightening more because you're stressed, and that type of thing over a sustained period of time can lead to straining. So I think it can have an effect on muscle. But I really think of stress as relating to overall health. And I think it's the first line of defense you have to have in terms of having health is try to rid yourself of stress in any way possible. So that to me is real important.
Yeah, and then the key detail of this is that you got to heal yourself in order to really try to be fully relaxed into your element, and really trying to understand that if you deal with your mental health, you deal with your physical health and all these other aspects, you're going to be living a pain-free life. You're going to be living a life where, yes, I'm not in pain mentally and physically. And that's something that people just don't realize, that, you know, the more you take care of yourself, the more you self-heal, kind of like what we talked about a few days ago, right? Where, you know, you do the self-healing, you take care of yourself, rewards come to you, and you start getting more rewards of success, right? So what is some success that you've made? What's some success that you have made from dealing with your mental health and dealing with your physical health?
So you're bringing up, like, really, the problem with just too many people is they're seeing their daily life as being very complicated, and there's lots of decisions, and they're building up expectations and anticipations of things to happen for them, whether they're financial or in relationships, and they're creating this setup where if things don't happen exactly as they thought they were, they're going to become disappointed. And what most people don't recognize is that they probably have had some self-loathing or self-esteem issues that were brought forth from their childhood or teenage years or early adulthood. And so when you build these opportunities for anticipation and expectation to fail, they may subconsciously begin to lead to feelings of inadequacy and not feeling good about yourself. And this is where you can begin to develop emotional distress that can be fed by having things not work out the way you want, having failures in life, things of this nature. And so as a result of that, I think that that's when health could become greatly impacted. And you could run into problems like where, let's say, you know, we could talk about any aspect. Let's say that you've had a couple of relationships and they haven't worked out. And you really, really wanted them to work out, so much so you wanted to be married by a certain point. And so what happens is those failures can make you start to say, well, is there something wrong with me? It must be me. There's something wrong with me. And suddenly you're not talking about the dating or the relationship. You're talking about your self-worth issues. Well, that sense of loss of self-worth and leading to self-loathing and self-questioning now carries over to everything that happens in your life. So suddenly you were expected to get a raise, and that raise didn't come. Well, you've already decided that you're a piece of shit because you haven't gotten married yet. And so as a result of that, the reason you didn't get the raise was not a legitimate reason. Oh, they didn't have the money. Or, it's you. It's you. It's your fault because you're not worthy of it. And this all basically becomes an overriding factor in everything that happens in every day of your life. And I know this because it's what happened to me from a child until the age of 58. This is how I ran my life. And so we were talking before, we talked about the person who commits crime, the person who does drugs, the person who is an alcoholic. And everyone's looking at the action. Forget the action. The action is the resultant of something. If someone loved themselves, really loved themselves, would they ever do drugs? Would they ever commit crime? Would they ever become an alcoholic? No. What are those actions? They're actions that they're attempting to hurt themselves. They're hurting themselves because they don't think themselves worthy of anything good. They are self-loathing because it's a mindset that developed from childhood or teenage years or something like that. And their entire life, the entire projection of their life's actions are based on that. I did the opposite. Instead of showing myself as doing negative things due to my self-worth and self-loathing issues, I did the opposite. I said, I'm going to make $1 gazillion. I'm going to be successful at everything. And so what you're saying to yourself there is, well, if I'm successful, then I must be okay. I must be an okay person. And so instead of doing negative things, anyone on the outside, and trust me, everybody did, said, you must be the happiest person in the world. You've written 3 books. You've done a PBS special. You have the most successful practice. And I'm telling you, internally, I never felt happy. Never felt happy. No matter what the success was, a day after the success, I was like, okay, what's next? How do I fill this void? And the amazing thing is, remember, 58 years, I never knew what the void was. I only knew the overriding feeling that I had. I'm not happy with all the success, marriage, kid, all of it. I had anyone on the outside would have said, God, that guy's got it all. And internally, I'm saying to myself, I have nothing. And strangely enough, the craziest part of the story is that in finding my wife, suddenly ex-wife saying, I want a divorce, it was like a hammer hits me in the head. And I start having these cathartic moments where I'm having these terrible senses of self-worth and self-loathing, and I suddenly see myself at 8 or 10 years old having the exact same feelings and literally seeing it acting out as an 8 or 10-year-old at 58. And it just made it all come to realization. It went from my subconscious to my conscience. And I suddenly said, oh my God, my reason for being unhappy is all these years, no matter how successful I was because I hated myself, which was developed as a child due to self-esteem issues, being thin, a lot of things in my life happening that I couldn't understand. And as a child, there was no way I should have been able to understand that. But because you're having these terrible self-esteem and self-loathing issues, you don't bring it up to your parents. You don't tell anybody about it. You just suppress it, which is why it sustains for over 50 years. And so as I came to that realization, and this is what I would recommend to anybody, if you do feel like that at some point, you have to forgive yourself. You have the very first part of healing is to say, I know I went through all those things and I thought I was bad, but I wasn't bad. I was just a person going through things I didn't understand. And so I forgave myself. And then I said, well, what is it that will make me happy? And there's a guy named Ram Dass. He's very heavy into this area. And he talks about the fact that the only emotion that comes from the heart is love. Every other emotion is actually thought in the brain. So anxiety, frustration, resentment, all the bad things that you think about are actually just in your head.
Wow.
And so if you this is wild stuff. And I'm telling you, I've been living this for 2 years And I can tell you this is true. This is 100% true. So I said to myself, if I could just live in my heart and just live through love, then I think I'm going to be happy, because what's happening for most people is as they're going through their day, they're not living the moment. They're caught in their thoughts, and the thoughts are usually negative. Oh, am I going to be able to complete this at that point? Oh, that stupid bastard, they did this to me and I hate them. Oh, this and it's all these bad things, emotions, but those emotions are stemming from their brain, their thoughts, and thoughts aren't real. So I started to train myself to say, I'm going to live in the moment. And as a thought would come in, I'd say, oh, I feel the thought coming. I don't want that. Let me get back to living. And as I began the process, it only, strangely enough, and I'm very fortunate, it only took me maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or two, not that long, to be able to now, and because of the fact that you then live in the moment, everything you do becomes hyper stimulated. I drink a cup of coffee in the morning outside looking at trees, and I think I've just saw God. I cook a meal for myself, and the idea that I cooked it for myself, I think is the greatest thing in the world. I do a treatment and someone's out of pain, I think it's great. I do a podcast, I work out, I do the laundry, I clean. Everything is so hyper stimulated because there's no other thoughts. I'm fully engaged in it, and I'm experiencing it at such a heightened level that it feels so good. And one thing I can tell you is that once you feel that, there is no materialistic good that you could get that will match the feeling, the unbelievable depth of feeling in your chest when you are living in love. I mean, truly in love, loving yourself, loving those around you, loving the things around you. It's incredible. And as a result of that, and this to me is really what I would like people to understand as the rubber hitting the road. It's now, I think I'm now over 2 years, and I've not had a single unhappy day.
No,
After
this is
58 years of saying, I don't think I had enough happy days in 58 years to count on two hands.
No, this is insane to live a happy, pain-free life and to just feel free of yourself and just realize that, you know, you are a human. You can make mistakes and you can fix them, and understand that, you know, you have to forgive yourself in order to move forward. There is mistakes that people make. There is things like that, and you're accountable for them. But sometimes life teaches you that, you know, you meet people and then some people leave, right? And it's just because of the fact that they were a part of your life in a certain chapter, and it taught you something on how to grow and be successful, right? And this is something that I've dealt with myself. This is something that I've dealt with in my lifestyle also. And it's good that I'm not the only one that thinks that, you know, if you love yourself, you create a better environment for yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually to really bring yourself to a pain-free life. Like you said, get your ass up, start working out, go start being proactive for yourself, start being free of yourself, and also love your family, love your connections, and really create growth, right? And I think that's what made you who you are today. And I'm so happy that you were able to find that after 58 years. You had it all. You had the show, you had a practice, you had the books, you had this, you had that, right? But it's like, you know, you can have everything in the world. They say money is great, but love is worth more than money. You know, and I think you just really hit the point in regards to that, right? And just hearing your perspectives and your values throughout this podcast has been very interesting. It's been a very good insight and knowledge to wake people up and say, hey, you know, this is something easy that I can do for myself. This is something that is manageable. This is not a challenge or tactic, or here's a product to make yourself feel better. This is something that we can't offer to anyone unless you do the work for it, right? So I think
Absolutely.
and I think what you said has really hit the spot. It was really engaging. I really loved your concepts and your theories, and it really hit home with me. And it hits home for a lot of other people that, you know, people don't love themselves anymore. And that's why the rates of suicide are going up, the rates of depression, the rates of everything. And because of the pandemic and people not getting the love that they need and the connections, that alone can cause some physical symptoms, right? And like what you said, you can't depend on medications to be successful. You have to do what your body is trained to do is by moving around, getting up, using your brain, and not just putting your head down for 8 to 10 hours and being on your phone or being on your computer. And taking that time away from yourself can really fix that for you, right? So I just wanted to say thank you for coming on to my podcast and really giving me insights and information to really help people that are struggling within this, not knowing how to love themselves, not knowing how to deal with their chronic pain, and actually dealing with their overall self. And I just really want to say thank you for your time, Mr. Yes. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I think that's the key here, is to understand that they actually are strongly connected. For the person who doesn't take care of themselves physically, who's constantly in physical pain, that's going to carry over to your sense of well-being, your sense of self-worth. You're not going to be able to have a good relationship. You're not going to be able to be successful in a job or whatever you want to do on a daily basis. So that's an issue in itself. On the other hand, if you're having mental issues, if you're not loving yourself, if you're getting down on yourself, you're gonna reach a point of depression, some level of depression, and that's gonna make you want to lay in your bed all day, not interact, and not have a fulfilling life. Well, what is that gonna do for your physical level? Well, it's gonna make you now susceptible to straining and pain. So
Yeah.
You gotta recognize that you gotta see these as independent. You really must recognize you live on earth, so there is a physical need to be able to function and have strength. You are an individual, a human with spirit and emotion. You need to sustain your sense of self-love and self-worth so that you're able to embrace whatever it is that you want to do and interact with those you want. So they're independent, and both must be addressed. The person must take responsibility for themselves and not allow others to name them. You're a criminal. You're an alcoholic. You're a drug user. No, do not allow that to happen to yourself. Try to go into yourself and say, why is this happening? And you're probably going to say, if you're having negative things happening in your life, it's probably because there's something about yourself you're not happy about. And that's just the way you're presenting to yourself, how you feel. Try to reach that point. And my area of expertise is the diagnosis and treatment of pain. But even through my personal voyage through this process of finding myself doing something unique and trying to reach people, I myself went through a spiritual and emotional renaissance. And I'm happy for it. And I love sharing that aspect just as much. So thank you for giving me the chance to give both sides of the story.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on to my podcast. And thank you for coming on to Lyfe Boost. I'm going to be putting all your information in the description below. Going to be sharing that to so many people. And I love your message. And thank you so much for being on my show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful.
It was fantastic. Great advice. And have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you too.